Mapping the territory. This chapter is one of the early chapters in Griffin's book in which he's trying to lay out in very, very broad terms the idea of theory in the social sciences. Of course, this book is about communication, so it's theory directed at communication, but what you're really grappling with in these first few chapters is the bigger idea of what it means to theorize or to make a theory. So what he does in this chapter is he presents you with a number of what he calls traditions. So these are not really truly specific theories, but they're sort of areas, schools of thought, you might say, wide areas within the social sciences where it could be a number of different theories might fall under any one tradition. And what defines a tradition are a bunch of ideas that people would believe in or hold to be true if they follow that particular tradition or those theories that fall under that heading. So each one he gives a label to. You really don't need to memorize these. I think it's more important to get the gist of what he's trying to say here, is that there are widely different ways of thinking about social behavior, and and these widely different ways can fall under a variety of traditions. So the first one he talks about, he refers to as socio-psychological tradition that has its influence, has its focus on influence. It's a scientific, objective perspective, meaning it is a perspective that talks about influence in terms of measurable variables, in terms of testing by collecting data. Truths about something in the world are discovered by careful, systematic observation, experiments where you set up variables that you want to study to find out if they influence other variables. This particular tradition, besides having those sort of methodological, experimental ways of going about knowing about something, this particular area in communication is concerned with influence. So he says the central question here is, what can I do to get them to change? So studies that are interested in getting other people to change their behavior, change their attitudes, change their beliefs, that are studied experimentally. There happens to be a bunch of studies that were done at Yale University on attitude change. And these are used as an example of the kind of study that falls under this tradition. The researcher would be interested in, who's speaking in terms of variables like their level of expertise, how much they're trusted. What is it that they're saying? What's the message? Are they appealing to fear? Is there a way in which they order their arguments? So these studies at Yale were done by pre-testing subjects on what they believed, presenting them with a message, and then post-testing them to see if they changed their beliefs, all with regard to some independent variables to see if those mattered. So you might have a message from a high credibility source compared to a lower credibility source. Will that make a difference? You have different groups of people who are exposed to these messages and pre-tested, exposed, post-tested. So The cybernetic tradition. I know that there's a lot about this tradition that is attractive to people, but I'm going to tell you a wholesale uh, um, reaction, at least that I have to it, is that essentially it's a tradition that I think is included mainly for its historical completeness. But I do not think that it's a tradition that, at least in the form it's offered here, receives a whole lot of attention these days. It's essentially cybernetic, the idea that something would put out a message and it'd be a response to that message which would serve as feedback to the originator, who could then adjust their message. So this idea of adjusting future behavior by taking into account past experience. It makes sense, except that this particular tradition really grew out of more of an interest in something like shooting a missile, trying to hit something, and then getting the feedback that you missed because you were a little bit too low, so the next time you shoot a little bit higher. Whether or not that can apply in any real easy way to human beings communicating is something you need to look at very, very carefully before you swallow this one. But anyway, that's the basic idea. The model that's often offered that goes along with the cybernetic tradition, which also seems very attractive to students in this course, but one which I would caution you against, is this idea that a message begins with some source. It's transmitted through something, whether through the air or paper or online, and as it's transmitted, some noise enters into the process, meaning actual physical noise possibly, or distractions, or breakdown of the signal. Some receiver receives the signal and processes it into its final form. Problem with this model, while it seems to make some sense, is that notice it's a very linear model. It starts at one point, it goes through stages to another point. There are, I think, other better ways of modeling the communication process, but this was an early model. The rhetorical tradition is one that celebrates the human ability to use language, to talk, to try to influence one another, to use public address, to make speeches, to try to persuade an audience through the use of language. It's really a very ancient, has ancient origins. People have been interested in the idea of, better and worse ability to speak, to persuade for thousands of years. In modern times, I think you'd find that rhetorical analysis begins to merge pretty closely with other traditions so that it's not as separate as it once was. This idea, I don't know that it's terribly important for us, that there might be a bias in the culture, that persuasion in the public arena is the province of males. In some ways, I think you'll see when you read Deborah Tannen in a few chapters, that there's some sense in which she makes use of this idea. The semiotic tradition, as soon as you hear the word semiotic, substitute the word meaning. Sharing meaning through signs. How is it that we can use signs and symbols to represent meaning, and how is it that we can interpret from signs and symbols? How is it that one thing can stand for something else? Very, very fascinating problem, and certainly worth all your attention. If you start at a simple level of sort of signs standing for something, you might say a high body temperature stands for infection. It's a sign of birds fly south, is a sign of coming winter. That's how the notion of a sign is used. Those are examples of signs. An expensive car signifies wealth. An arrow designates which direction to go. Words are often talked about as a special kind of sign, a sign that is maybe a little more complicated in some ways than something like, dark clouds or a sign of rain. Words not only stand in a one-to-one relationship with some meaning, but they're much more flexible than that. They allow us to talk about things that may not exist. They allow us to talk about things that are not true. Symbols have a kind of complicated structure that not only point to things in the world, but also are associated with with concepts. So you may have come across this idea of I.A. Richards' idea dealing with, I guess we don't have it here, do we? Okay. I was going to point to the semantic triangle, but okay. The sociocultural tradition, communication as the creation and enactment of social reality. This is a little bit confusing, I think. Sociocultural tradition. This is based on the idea that people talk, that as they talk, they produce and they reproduce culture. That talk is not something that just is already prefabricated and we simply select, but as we speak, we are reinforcing a certain view of the world, of who we are, who we think the other guy is. They don't simply, according to this view, words don't just point to things that are out there, and they're simply names for these things. This tradition is saying that in addition to pointing to things, which words do, words can also create a reality, bring about certain images, some of which may not be, accurate in terms of the physical world. There's a famous hypothesis known as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis that takes a strong position on this idea of words creating reality. The idea that language directs our attention to certain aspects of the world. It, in that sense, structures our perceptions. It brings our attention to some things and at the same time maybe hides other things. The critical tradition is a kind of break with what we've been talking about so far. It's more of a political perspective, I would say. It's concerned with the unjust distribution of wealth, of suffering, of how different people in society, some have and some don't have. Critical theory is an analysis of the society in terms of power, in terms of control, and also it looks at language in terms of how language may enter into power relationships, how the media, the mass media, play a role in maintaining power for some segments of society. And it may, hold down others. It is not a perspective that thinks much about scientific method and empirical findings. It's much more of a sort of armchair argument, political argument about power in society. The phenomenological tradition a lot like the semiotic tradition, I think, immediately brings to mind the idea of perception, meaning, everyday life from the standpoint of the person who is living it. How does it look through your eyes? What does it mean to you? And it would be one thing for, for us to impose some idea on a situation, maybe give the official view, but what does it really mean to the individual? What's their experience of an event? What are the interpretations that are subjective? How would you tell what's going on? Talk which furthers understanding what it is like to be the person. How do we get to know what it's like to be a college student, to be a soldier in combat, to be a religious leader? I mean, we have our images, but what is it like through their eyes? Reference is made to Carl Rogers, a famous therapist, writer, who talks about congruence, unconditional positive regard, and empathic understanding. Congruence meaning a compatibility between what we see on the outside and what's going on the inside. Unconditional positive regard meaning I'm not judging someone negatively, but no conditions attached. We will regard them positively, accept what they have to tell us about their world. Empathic understanding from their point of view. Rogers talked about these principles as being effective as he did therapy with patients, that this helped to free people and make them feel good about themselves and so on. The match between individuals' inner feelings and outer display, genuine, real, integrated whole, unconditional positive regard, warmth, liking, caring, respect, interest. You can imagine that if you were treated with these attitudes, you would probably respond well to the person who offered that to you. Empathic understanding, the caring skill of temporarily laying aside our views and values and of entering into another's world without prejudice, an active process of hearing the other's thoughts, feelings, tones. Not easy to do, easy to say, but try it sometime. Not easy to do. Oh, the pages may vary, by the way, because I often take these notes from earlier versions of the book. So you may find, a different page, or it may be even that a diagram that was once there is no longer there. So there are 7 of these traditions that are mapped out. And what Griffin does in the book is he uses the idea of objective and interpretive as ways, as a dimension, with objective on one side and interpretive on the other. And he lays these traditions out on this dimension so that objective, meaning scientific, measured, tested approach, you would have cybernetic and sociological on the left as very objective. Not that they're any truer, but that objective in the sense of you can measure stuff. It's not your opinion. Phenomenology, critical thinking, sociocultural, those are more toward the right. They're all on a line between objective and interpretive. Interpretive having more to do with making sense out of offering meaning